Welcome to Storytimer. Delores Wells. Dolores Jean Alkira was born September 5th, 1968, to John and Margaret Alkira. She married David Wells on June 9th, 1984. The couple welcomed a son in 1985. In 1987, Dolores Wells was a mom and homemaker caring for her 2-year-old boy, David Lee. It should have been a joyful time in her life. On January 26, 1987, all that changed. She was walking home from a relative's house in Terre, Haute when she was kidnapped. Dolores was abducted on January 26, 1987, by Bill Benefiel. He grabbed her and put her in his blue van and took her to one of his 2 rundown homes on 13th and Haute Street in North Terre Haute. She would not be alone there in her captivity. Bill Benefiel had already abducted teenager Alicia Elmore on October 10, 1986. She had been walking to a corner store to buy her mother a soda. Her mom was sick and thought the soft drink would help settle her stomach. Alicia had been there for months now and endured horrific sexual, psychological, and physical abuse. But she saved her own life by convincing Benefiel that she loved him. It was a brilliant survival tactic. Alicia had been through the unimaginable. She never knew what to expect next. Benefiel would assault her and beat her one day. The next he would be elated about something he had managed to steal. Some days he would just sit in the next room crying. He even took her to Vincennes for medical care once. He had a gun and stayed very close by. He threatened to kill her if she spoke up. She was so terrified that she did not say a word to the medical staff. Terror is a powerful thing. Alicia was a survivor, though. She kept going even when she realized she was pregnant. Her will to live and to survive was admirable. Astonishingly, Benefiel had a wife and 3 children living next door to the house in which he kept the women. He regularly beat his wife. She lived in fear of him. The 2 lived largely separate lives in 1987, and yet she felt strangely loyal to him. Benefiel's homes on 13th and Half Street were ramshackle places and were full of stolen goods. He regularly burglarized homes and then hoarded the things that he took. He dug tunnels and holes to hide things in. I don't even know if he legally owned the houses or if they were abandoned and he had taken them over just because no one was around to prevent it. They both looked like they should have been condemned in the 1987 photos. It looks like, if you look on Google Earth, it looks like they've all since been demolished. Benefiel's wife knew about the first kidnapped girl in December of 1986. She told her sister, and her sister called the police and told them in mid-January that Benefiel was holding a woman captive. Nothing happened. The police did not rush over and check on the tip, even though they knew about Alicia Elmore's disappearance. She had been reported missing, and they were working on that disappearance case. Who was Bill Benefiel? He was born in 1956 and had apparently some birth defects and a very low IQ. Children at school teased him and beat him up. His mother, Helen Benefiel, regularly said he was, quote, born with half a brain. Most schools did not have a special education program. He had a very rough upbringing, and he had anger issues. In 1971, at the age of 15, he was almost committed to a children's home in Lebanon, Indiana, but the judge inexplicably never signed the papers. His school then believed he was in Lebanon, Indiana. The children's home in Lebanon had no idea that he should be with them, and so Benefiel just never went to school after that. The judge never followed up on it. Social workers believed he was in Lebanon as well. Benefiel had slipped through the cracks of an overburdened and underfunded social service system. His father was not around. He would later learn that his mother was not his biological mother. She gave no explanation as to how Bill Benefiel had come into her care. If you search old newspaper archives for reports of Alicia Elmore's disappearance back in 1986, you won't find anything. The attitude by the media in Terre Haute seems to have been that she had just run away. Another missing teenager wasn't going to sell papers. I don't know if there was a local effort to put posters up and spread the word that way. I would imagine her family was desperate. She had disappeared while walking to a nearby store. She had taken nothing with her. She had not run away, but without a big media response, even if someone had seen this girl in the window of that home, they probably would not have thought about a missing girl and made that connection. Benefiel raped the two women repeatedly. Alicia said that she began counting her rapes when she first was abducted, thinking it might do something, might be needed in a court of law later. But she stopped counting after 64. In her first months of captivity, Benefield kept her tied to a bed with her eyes taped shut, headphones on, and a gag to prevent her from making noise. He did not bring her food or water very often, and at first did not allow her access to a toilet. When he decided to take the tape off her eyes, it was Benefield who had to pry her eyelids open. When Delores was first kidnapped, she was kept in the basement. Alicia knew that it was cold there and convinced Benefield to bring her upstairs. He did not keep the women in the same room, though. Delores was tied up in the kitchen. On February 7th, Benefield came back to the house with dirt and mud on his clothes. He had blisters on his hands and told Alicia that he had been digging a grave big enough for two. Alicia was convinced that both she and Delores would be killed that day. Delores was killed by Bill Benefield on February 7, 1987. He forced a very strong glue into her nostrils and glued them shut. He wrapped her head in adhesive tape. She died an incredibly torturous death of asphyxiation. Alicia Elmore was rescued from Benefield's house on February 10, 1987. Police were 3 days too late to rescue Delores. If they had listened to the tips called in by Bill Benefield's sister-in-law, they could have rescued Alicia in January and completely prevented the kidnapping and murder of Delores Wells. Delores Wells' body was found on February 22, 1987. Glue residue was still in her nostrils. Tape residue was still on her face and hair. Benefield had buried her in a shallow grave in a wooded area near the intersection of 25th Street and Spring Hill Road in South Terre Haute. I happen to know a bit of backstory about this case. In the early 1990s, I lived in Terre Haute, and I dated a man who had been friends with Alicia Elmore. Let's call him Brian. They went to high school together and had dated briefly. Alicia, after she was kidnapped, police came to Terre Haute South High School to question her friends. They zeroed in on Brian. Brian was not a clean-cut looking young man. He wore black t-shirts, jeans, and black boots. He had dark hair and dark eyes. He did not look like a nice guy. He actually was a fairly nice guy, but his outward appearance did not reflect that. They held him in an office there at school and began with friendly questions. He answered honestly. Soon they began to push him about a scratch on his arm or a bruise here or there. Their questions turned to accusations. Brian was an intelligent and well-read young man, despite looking like a roadie for a heavy metal band. He was also very socially savvy. He knew pretty quickly what the officers were trying to do. He clammed up and demanded a lawyer. He said nothing else, even though they held him there for hours. The police made threats and said they would personally see him prosecuted for this crime. What crime? Alicia was still missing at that point and considered a runaway. Brian sat there with his arms folded. They took his silence as an aggressive mood. They continued to grill him. And he continued to remain silent. At the last bell of the day, they let him go. He went straight to a payphone and called the law office of a friend of his mother. I don't know if the lawyer said anything to the police, but the pressure on Brian ended. Brian did say that the police car seemed to be driving past his house a little more than usual, but he wasn't questioned again. Keep in mind that he was a minor. He was not arrested and was never read his Miranda rights. His parents were not present. He was not advised that he could have a lawyer present. All of this questioning was completely out of bounds. A few years later, Brian was working as a short order cook at a restaurant. He was taking a break and talking with another cook there. That man happened to be the widower of Delores Wells. David Wells and he spoke about the questioning both had undergone. Police had put David Wells through the ringer, too, about the disappearance of his wife. Of course, police have to question individuals who are close to the victim, but both men agreed that the questioning used was intimidating and threatening. Both men felt that they were very likely to be railroaded into a conviction for a crime they didn't commit. And they had a moment there of sharing that terror. I am writing this not to shame and blame the police. Yes, mistakes were made. Yes, their tactics were wrong. But they really had no idea what kind of predator they were really dealing with in Benefil. Even with the massive numbers of violent crimes in Indiana in the years before, it's hard to imagine a predator like this in your town. This was the Terre Haute of ISU and Larry Bird, after all. Police were also dealing with a lot of everyday crime there. Terre Haute was economically depressed in the 1990s when I lived there, and it wasn't any better in the 70s and 80s. All the problems that come with poverty were there. I learned a lot of streetwise skills that have helped me out a great deal as I've traveled the country in the past decades. Terre Haute's also a college town, so there's always a great deal of drinking, partying, rape, drunk driving, and fighting associated with that college crowd. There are a lot of lessons we can learn from this case, though. I think we need to fully fund social services. We need to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Benefil was a terrible adult, but as a kid, he really could have used some help, some social services to help out with the things he was going through. In 2005, Bill Benefil was executed by the state of Indiana by lethal injection. My question is, I wonder if Benefil had other victims out there. Were there victims that he did not take home? Were there victims in the home that he disposed of before 1986? Delores Wells deserves to be here. She deserved to raise her child. She deserved a long and peaceful life with her husband and family. Rest in peace, Delores Jean Wells.